Polar vortex. A circumpolar vortex, or simply polar vortex, is a large region of cold rotating air that encircles both of Earth's polar regions. Polar vortices also exist on other rotating, low-obliquity planetary bodies. The term polar vortex can be used to describe two distinct phenomena: the stratospheric polar vortex and the tropospheric polar vortex. The stratospheric and tropospheric polar vortices both rotate in the direction of the Earth's spin, but they are distinct phenomena that have different sizes, structures, seasonal cycles, and impacts on weather. The stratospheric polar vortex is an area of high-speed, cyclonically rotating winds around 15 km to 50 km high, poleward of 50 degrees, and is strongest in winter. It forms in autumn when Arctic or Antarctic temperatures cool rapidly as the polar night begins. The increased temperature difference between the pole and the tropics causes strong winds, and the Coriolis effect causes the vortex to spin up. The stratospheric polar vortex breaks down in spring as the polar night ends. A sudden stratospheric warming, SSW, is an event that occurs when the stratospheric vortex breaks down during winter. The tropospheric polar vortex is often defined as the area poleward of the tropospheric jet stream. The equatorward edge is around 40 degrees to 50 degrees, and it extends from the surface up to around 10 km to 15 km. Its yearly cycle differs from the stratospheric vortex because the tropospheric vortex exists all year, but is similar to the stratospheric vortex since it is also strongest in winter when the polar regions are coldest. The tropospheric polar vortex was first described as early as 1853. The stratospheric vortex's SSWs were discovered in 1952 with radiosonde observations at altitudes higher than 20 km. The tropospheric polar vortex was mentioned frequently in the news and weather media in the cold North American winter of 2013-2014, popularizing the term as an explanation of very cold temperatures. The tropospheric vortex increased in public visibility in 2021 as a result of extreme frigid temperatures in the central United States, with experts linking its effects to climate change. Ozone depletion occurs within the polar vortices, particularly over the southern hemisphere, reaching a maximum depletion in the spring. Polar vortices are weakest during summer and strongest during winter. Extratropical cyclones that migrate into higher latitudes when the polar vortex is weak can disrupt the single vortex, creating smaller vortices, cold core lows, within the polar air mass. Those individual vortices can persist for more than a month. When the Arctic vortex is at its strongest, there is a single vortex, but normally, the Arctic vortex is elongated in shape, with two cyclone centers, one over Baffin Island in Canada and the other over northeast Siberia. When the Arctic pattern is at its weakest, subtropic air masses can intrude poleward, causing the Arctic air masses to move equatorward, as during the winter 1985 Arctic outbreak. The Antarctic polar vortex is more pronounced and persistent than the Arctic one. In the Arctic, the distribution of land masses at high latitudes in the northern hemisphere gives rise to Rossby waves, which contribute to the breakdown of the polar vortex, whereas in the southern hemisphere the vortex is less disturbed. The breakdown of the polar vortex is an extreme event known as a sudden stratospheric warming. Here the vortex completely breaks down, and an associated warming of 30-50 degrees, 54 and 90 degrees, clarification needed, over a few days can occur. The waxing and waning of the polar vortex is driven by the movement of mass and the transfer of heat in the polar region. In the autumn, the circumpolar winds increase in speed, and the polar vortex rises into the stratosphere. The result is that the polar air forms a coherent rotating air mass, the polar vortex. As winter approaches, the vortex core cools, the winds decrease, and the vortex energy declines. Once late winter and early spring approach, the vortex is at its weakest. As a result, during late winter, large fragments of the vortex air can be diverted into lower latitudes by stronger weather systems intruding from those latitudes. In the lowest level of the stratosphere, strong potential vorticity gradients remain, and the majority of that air remains confined within the polar air mass into December in the southern hemisphere, and April in the northern hemisphere, well after the breakup of the vortex in the mid-stratosphere. The breakup of the northern polar vortex occurs between mid-March to mid-May. This event signifies the transition from winter to spring and has impacts on the hydrological cycle, growing seasons of vegetation, and overall ecosystem productivity. The timing of the transition also influences changes in sea ice, ozone, air temperature, and cloudiness. Early and late polar breakup episodes have occurred due to variations in the stratospheric flow structure and upward spreading of planetary waves from the troposphere. Clarification needed. As a result of increased waves into the vortex experiences more rapid warming than normal, resulting in an earlier breakup and spring. When the breakup comes early, it is characterized by clarification needed, with persistent of remnants of the vortex. When the breakup is late, the remnants dissipate rapidly. When the breakup is early, there is one warming period from late February to middle March. When the breakup is late, there are two warming periods, one January and one in March. Zonal mean temperature, wind, and geopotential height exert varying deviations from their normal values before and after early breakups, while the deviations remain constant before and after late breakups. Scientists are connecting a delay in the Arctic vortex breakup with a reduction of planetary wave activities, few stratospheric sudden warming events, and depletion of ozone. Scientists monitor and study the polar vortex using satellite observations, weather balloons, and computer models. Understanding the polar vortex is crucial for improving weather predictions, particularly during the winter months, when it can have significant impacts on weather patterns. Thank you for joining me on this journey to understand the polar vortex. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more intriguing insights into the world of science and weather. The end.